Hi, I'm Stella O'Malley, a psychotherapist in Ireland.
And I'm Sasha Ayad, an adolescent therapist in the United States.
And this is Gender, a Wider Lens, a podcast dedicated to the shifting concepts around gender in our contemporary culture.
Through in-depth interviews, personal stories, and psychological exploration, we seek to open up the discourse around this hot-button issue.
Join us as we look at gender from a wider lens.
Hi, Stella.
How's it going, Sasha?
It's going well. I am really glad that we got to talk to Shawn Thierry today. She's a representative from the state of Texas, where I spent many of my years. And she just has a very refreshing perspective on a lot of topics. And so we're very excited to share this episode with listeners today.
Yeah, I think Shawn Thierry is an inspiration. You know, we kind of very often have a lot of academics talking very highfalutin language, an awful lot of high concepts, and it can be easy for people to feel a little bit lost among the weeds and that they daren't speak up. But Shawn Thierry, who is a very successful woman, who was named, one of Houston's top 30 most influential women, so she's extraordinary. She's a representative. But also she talks in straight, easy to understand language. She's a very powerful speaker, but she says it straight. She doesn't mess around with complicated language. And I think we could learn from her.
Yeah. Shawn, often I've heard her say this, and you'll hear her say it in the episode. Sometimes this overly complex academic language is precisely used to confuse and intimidate people. And even from working with so many parents, they'll say to me, I can't talk with my child about this. They have so much jargon and they say all these complicated things. And I'm like, no, just listen to Shawn. I mean, she's an incredibly intelligent woman, and she knows that keeping things simple is actually the way to speak effectively and clearly and speak from the heart. So we really appreciated Shawn's wisdom and ability to communicate today. And she describes a couple of things that I think many of our listeners will notice, like the way many progressives began to shift further and further to the left. She describes it as the progressive abyss that many of her colleagues and friends and others from the left she witnessed start to kind of fall into this strange space. And so, in light of that, she tells us about some shocking conversations that she had with colleagues who basically asked her not to think too hard about various subjects and just kind of vote along with her party and her tribe, even if she felt very conflicted about doing so.
I think listeners will be shocked listening to this episode. I think the way Shawn tells it as it is, and she gave that very powerful speech around the legislation of SB 14, where she was very instrumental in passing legislation that made sure that the minimum age for gender transition procedures was existed to age 18, because prior to Shawn's intervention and to this legislation coming in, there was no minimum age. So it was kind of open season. And Shawn gave this, and she was very, very courageous. She did her research, she looked it up, and then she gave a speech knowing that this was going to be arguably the downfall of her career. Certainly it was going to have a very serious impact. And yet she still spoke up. So I think when we hear Shawn Thierry, and we were so delighted when she's director of public policy in Gen Spectre. We were so delighted when she came on board, because it's like, with people like Shawn Thierry in the world, we can get places. A straight talking woman who isn't afraid to say it as it is, and who is willing to risk things on behalf of other people. She didn't have skin in the game. She just wanted to do the right thing. And there's so many people who don't do the right thing. I think it's refreshing to hear people who do.
Yeah, for sure. And, Shawn will explain she took 2 years to research this particular issue around gender transition and minors. And you can hear in the speech that she gave, her voice was quaking. She had apparently been up all night receiving kind of threatening text messages. Someone had doxed her phone number or something. So she really was willing to sacrifice a lot in order to do what she felt was right, and really against what she calls the adulting of children, like trying to turn children into adults. And so it's an amazing conversation. And I'll just tell you a little bit more about Shawn. She's the first and only woman to serve the Texas House District 146. She's an alumna of Howard University and Thurgood Marshall School of Law, and she's been practicing as an attorney for 27 years, and she's the director of public policy for GenSpect USA. Now in her fourth term, Representative Thierry is the vice chair of the House of Ways and Means Committee and a member of the Energy Resources Committee. Known as a voice for the voiceless, she's championed mental health and authored over 80 impactful bills. Recognized as one of Houston's top 30 most influential women, she continues to advocate for inclusive and thoughtful policymaking. We hope you enjoy this conversation. Hi, Stella, and we're so excited to have you. Shawn, welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, and maybe good afternoon on the other side of the world. I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's afternoon for me. We're delighted to have you on, Shawn. Like, you know, I think you've come on a significant political journey that many of us have come on, but yours has been in the public eye. I think we're all going through a kind of a period of transition almost politically. And I think your story represents a lot of people's stories. So we're really pleased, and also pleased because, of course, you're director of public policy in GenSpect. So we're particularly thrilled to have you.
Thank you. It's been an interesting journey, to say the least.
Yeah. Why don't you tell us? I mean, I think some people will know your story, some may not. You are a representative in Texas, historically Democratic, and you recently changed your affiliation to Republican. Tell us how you ended up initially as a Democrat and what led you to change.
Sure. So I always tell folks when I tell this part of the story, I feel like I need to give a little bit of a caveat because I've been a lifelong Democrat. My parents were Democrats. But the caveat is my family was always relatively conservative in their views on most issues. But if I had to just kind of think about why my parents were Democrats. I mean, they're African Americans. My mom is 84. She just turned 84. My dad would be the exact same age if he were still living. And they were just hardworking people, middle class folks. My mom was an educator. She's an English teacher. And she got her master's degree in counseling, and she taught 57 years in the school district. And my dad worked for the city of Houston. And so they just were good, hardworking Christians. And I think they believed that the Democratic Party was, at that time, what they believed, the party of the people, the working class. And now it seems like that party has left us. It is the party now of the elites and no longer relatable to just everyday working folks who are trying to educate their children, pay their bills, and basically live in an America that is consistent with the dream, where small business owners thrive, and at the same time, where just some basic truths still exist. Like, I'll just get cut right to the chase. My father would have probably fallen out of his chair if I had told him that the Democratic Party believes now that men can have babies. That would have been a deal breaker for him, or that he was supposed to say such a thing. Yeah. He would have never, ever supported biological men being in women's dressing rooms, playing, and he was a sports fanatic. In fact, I'm a communications major, than my undergraduate degree. I'm a lawyer by profession, but I went to college to be a sports commentator because my father watched so much sports growing up. He told me, he's like, you should be one of those women that gets out there on the field and interviews the guys and all of that. And I ended up taking a detour and going to law school, but he would have never thought that biological men would be taking trophies away from women, would be taking their endorsements, their scholarship opportunities, their titles. So fast forward, I got elected to become a member of the Texas legislature in 2016, was sworn in 2017 as a Democrat. Folks asked me to run because they just saw my work in the community. And I think they thought that I would be a great advocate for the elderly, for children. I spoke heavily and passed major pieces of legislation on anti-human trafficking. I ended up taking the lead on protecting women in childbirth, maternal mortality. So all of these things were fine at the time, but I did notice a fraction growing in the party. From the moment I was sworn in, session after session, I saw the Democratic Party move further and further to the extreme, to the left. It's not even, I don't even think it's fair to just say the left. It is
Yeah.
some sort of, I've come up with a name. I call it the progressive abyss because it has
Very
no
good.
end. Yes, it just goes on and on and on until you just eventually slide off of a cliff.
Yeah.
And that's where we are. And so last session is when I had to say, stop, I have to get off here. I can't go sliding off the cliff with you and take millions of children with me when the Democratic Party decided that they were going to draw a line in the sand and say that as it relates to the transgender issue, that children now should be getting sex change surgeries. Children as young as 8 years old should be taking puberty blockers. Children as young as 12 should be taking estrogen and testosterone. The opposite sex, should I say.
Yeah.
Girls taking testosterone. And I was asked to advocate for that. And that's when I said, this is harmful. This is child abuse. There's no ands, ifs, buts about it. People like to complicate it, but it's not. And so I spoke out against it. I voted for the bill that very reasonably set the age to 18, just like many other pieces of public policy across our nation.
Yeah.
And I won't do the spoiler alert, but immediately afterwards, I was mercilessly attacked by the progressives. And I eventually switched parties, not for political expedience or acumen or alliances, but to make a statement that I no longer align with this party if this is their value system.
Can I just ask a couple things? So when you were initially kind of a legislator, that was 2017, right? When you started to see this progressive sliding, as you described it. And that's interesting. We often kind of ask people about timelines because it did seem like there was, at least in the gender world, 2015, 2016, 2017 is when we really started to see a lot of pressure from trans activists, some things kind of becoming more in the public consciousness. So that's very interesting. And I'm curious for you, was the progressive abyss that you describe mostly because of the advocacy for medicalizing children, or were there other progressive issues that you saw kind of sliding into an abyss?
There were multiple issues. They were all moving on the fast track. I believe their primary issue from the activists was the transgenderizing medically of children. However, parallel to that, which is, I believe, the whole agenda, was the over-sexualization of children at a very young age. I called it the adulting of children, where the whole purpose was to, session after session, blur the lines between what is a child and what is an adult. We saw it with books. I also voted for HB 900, which was a very reasonable bill, which simply put ratings on books that were sexually explicit so that they would be age appropriate. Now, this was in public schools, taxpayer dollars. We found, it was shocking, hundreds and hundreds, I guess I would say in the thousands of titles of passages of content that I would not be allowed to read on the House floor because it was so obscene, so profane, many of it flat out pornographic. In fact, when I tried to read some of it, I was told to stop, Representative. This is inappropriate. I would go to other representatives, and these activists said it was censorship, but they didn't want to acknowledge that it was no different than putting a rating on a movie where a child shouldn't see a rated R movie. At least there's a warning.
Yeah.
That this is not a rated X movie. Who would take a 9-year-old to go see that? So we noticed that parallel to that, it was the sexualization of children. It became biological males and women's sports. It was drag queen shows for children to watch. All of this was moving at the same time. But I believe the hill that they really are still prepared to die on is this medicalization of children, giving children drugs, poisoning their bodies, and then eventually amputating body parts.
Yeah.
Oh, when you say they, who are you talking about there? Or is it kind of vague that there is a group out there, or is it just this feeling that the Democrats are kind of sliding into something that they're not quite sure that they're what they're doing?
I think that's a great question, Stella. Some folks have asked me, like, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Like, was it the Democrats that started this and then they went and found the activist groups, or was it the other way around? Obviously, I don't have a complete crystal ball, but what I fundamentally believe, because I was a Democrat for so long and we weren't hearing this, it is that there were certain transgender activist groups that are coalesced not just in America, around the world. I mean, we see this in Australia, and all of this started in Europe, and now Europe is backing away from it. They've caught on, and then they came on over to the United States, which we were really on the tail end. We're really usually on the forefront of things, but we're on the tail end of this radical movement. And so this transgender ideologist groups, they decided that I believe they paired up with what they felt would be sympathetic groups, such as, lesbian and gay groups, who traditionally were more aligned with the Democratic Party. And they tried to mask this as a human rights issue. So the Human Rights Campaign got involved. And before you know it, and it was very surreptitious. It was and duplicitous, should I say. They started to put it in. This is why there's all this controversy about DEI, diversity and equity. Typically, that was, back in the old days, that was about race and sex, making sure that women weren't being discriminated in the workplace and that African Americans weren't being discriminated. Well, the word inclusion came in, and the I. And what that really started to mean was this whole transgender ideology. It wasn't just lesbian and gay. I mean, it was transgender. That is when they went through corporate America and started insisting that people use certain pronouns. And then I think the real coup d'etat of it all, and this is still a problem, and the bill that I voted for doesn't address this problem, was going into the school systems. The indoctrination of kids.
I read a great article just recently about MEI, merit, excellence, and integrity, to take over from DEI, which sounded
That's
great.
a great one. That's a great one. We need to get that going.
We need integrity.
Yes, that's it. And if you think about it, you all, when you hear, and I've said this, I believe, on some other webinars or podcasts, when you hear these groups say, my 4-year-old told me that they're non-binary, how do they know what that word is? That's not common vocabulary for a 4-year-old. And as a parent, if you didn't say that, if you didn't teach them that, which many parents are the culprits, but for those that are not, where are they hearing this type of language? And so the ideologues have made a very clever use of language to make this seem very charming and benign.
Yeah.
And that is how they've gotten kids to start thinking that this is what they are.
I would love to pick up on that point, because this is actually a very common dynamic. I do a lot of consultation with parents whose kids are going through this identity questioning. And something I hear a lot, and Stella, I'm sure you've heard this too, parents will say, my kid is so smart. They know all this language. They have all of these words.
Yeah.
They have all these definitions. And like just the other day, I was consulting with a parent who said, I tried to challenge my child on this, and my child said, this is the same thing as segregation, like about the trans women in sports thing. So I think it's nefarious, to be honest, the way young kids who don't really understand the complexity of like racial struggle and all of our civil rights, history, how they're being given these very simplistic parallels, supposedly. And I think the kids are in some ways innocent. They're captured. They don't really know any better. And they parrot out these phrases and these analogies without understanding anything. And in my experience, sometimes parents feel so caught off guard, they don't even know how to answer that. So I mean, what do you think about that? Especially, I've heard you talk about your parents and their experience in the civil rights struggle. Like, how baffling is it to hear like 14-year-old suburban kids make that parallel when they don't know what they're talking about at all? What do you think?
It's tragic. And that goes to underscore how malicious the intent is. They are taking advantage of the natural empathy that young people have. There is a level of empathy that children have. And because they haven't been hardened to the ways of the world yet. And that's what we mean when we say preserving the innocence of children. That's what I mean. It's not just the sexual innocence of children. It is the fundamental imagination and trust of children and the belief in the good of the world. And so what they're doing, and this is why this is just so harmful, is they're capitalizing on that. They're going in and they're using history and struggles like segregation, the civil rights struggle, and true discrimination, and saying, look what happened to these people. You wouldn't want that to happen to these people here now, would you? And as you said, it's a false equivalency. It's overly elementary, and it is manipulating the natural empathy of the very young child, of an adolescent. And that is how they capture them. And so when the mom or the dad comes back and tries to explain that or say, wait a minute, it's not the same, then they build that divide between parent and child, because now the child is saying, well, wait a minute, mom, dad, you don't care about people. You're bad, they're good. That's another way they're pulling children away from their families. And I will tell you all, this is nothing new under the sun. This is all cult 101 tactics. And I don't mind saying it. This is exactly what cultist organizations do. They find ways to separate people from their loved ones by making them believe that their loved ones are very uncaring people, that they don't understand the plight of either the world or the mission that the cult is trying to accomplish. And so that's what I mean in terms of preserving the innocence of children. And that is, and it's almost like, I don't know if you saw some of the videos that have been going around on TikTok or on the web, where they'll ask a little child who's maybe 5 and say, what would you do if a stranger asked you to get in their van because they have puppies and a lot of candy? And these are kids who've been trained to not go with strangers. And there's one darling little girl that goes, what? She goes, I would say yes. Like, she immediately is like, yes, I'd love to go where the puppies are. And it is exactly what she's supposed to say. That child is the same child that may go to school tomorrow and would have to hear this level of indoctrination from transgender ideologues by telling her that other people are hurting, this marginalized group of people. And that's why we have to speak out.
Yeah.
May I ask you about you speaking out? Because, did you know that you were going to have the fallout that you had? Like, you ended up leaving the Democrats as a result. Your entire life has changed course as a result of, as you say, a very reasonable, we should just make this 18 and over. That was your point. Could you tell us about when you decided to speak out? Were you kind of nervous, and did you know it was going to be so impactful?
Well, when I first, yes, it's quite riveting on some level. So when I first started to read about the legislation, I said, well, this makes total sense. 18, I hope that this will be a bipartisan bill. So I talked to the authors of the bill in the House. Republican author, Dr. Tom Oliverson, was the author, and a Senator, Donna Campbell, carried the Senate version. And Dr. Oliverson said, Shawn, the bill only sets it to 18, not 21. So he said, is it possible that we'll have bipartisan support for this? Because it was, the age was relatively low, and it was consistent with all of the other policy in our country when it comes to protecting children. And I want people to kind of keep this in mind, use this as a footnote. It was the Democrats that believe in raising the age on everything, typically, when it comes to children, because the Democrats said, hear me on this, that they're the party of science, and they use scientific data to say that the frontal lobe of the brain is not fully developed in children. Therefore, we should raise the age from children from 18 to 21 to carry a gun because they can't appreciate the consequences. And that when you're under 21, you make more impulsive decisions because the frontal lobe of your brain. However, they have completely ignored this science and this argument when it comes to medicalizing children that they say are transgender. So I thought then that there may be a chance that other colleagues would get on board. Very quickly, I was told from the caucus with very little discussion that we were all supposed to try to kill the bill to make sure that there would be no age that was set. And that, Stella, yes, it really did surprise me. There was not healthy debate about it at all. The bill was immediately branded as a hate bill, a bill that was targeting the LGBTQIA plus community, and that we were all supposed to line up one behind the other and do all that we could to kill this legislation. And so when word got out that I was not on board, because I started talking to members, Democratic colleagues, I started showing them data. I started asking them, do you even know what a puberty blocker is? And one after another, ladies, had no idea. Yet they were saying, this is all fine to give children. I asked them, do you know how cross-sex hormones work? No, I do not. Do you know that a child could get a hysterectomy? Do you know that they would be giving girls double mastectomies that do not have cancer? They didn't know anything. So once I started explaining it, there was some fear and trepidation in the caucus that I was, kind of pulling the lid off things. So what happened very quickly is they started calling up lots of organizations and telling them to come to my office, LGBTQIA plus organizations, to lobby me or try to convince me to back off and to get in line.
Wow.
And they tried everything. And what was sad is I did listen. That's not the sad part. I listened, but what's sad is their stories were so extreme that they actually made the point on how we really needed this legislation. I had a mom who came and brought her daughter, who she identifies as her son now. No, I'm sorry, her son, who she identifies as her daughter, her biological son, and said that she knew that he was trans when he was 4 because she took him to DSW to get some tennis shoes, and he loved the ones that light up.
Wow.
And my heart just broke.
Yeah.
And I said, so what's going on now? And now her biological son is 13, and she had already taken him to a gender clinic in Texas.
Yeah.
To start putting him on hormones. So I knew I had to say something. I did start, Stella, the real answer to your question is yes, I knew it would be bad because I started getting death threats. And the night before I took the vote, I didn't sleep a wink. That's why when you see my speech, I was shaking. I was in tears. People that they had given my phone number out. And the number of awful text messages they were sending and the phone calls, I had to eventually just turn my phone off. But I didn't sleep a wink. And the threats were,
what were they saying?
You will lose your... Well, they would send me memes with blood dripping on the photos. They were telling me that they hoped that my daughter, who's only 12 now, she was 10 at the time, Claire, wakes up an orphan. They basically told me that children were going to die because of me. Oh, no. All of that, all the things that have been debunked about suicide.
Yeah.
Shawn, and
the
biggest thing, the political threat was we're going to make you lose your seat, which that threat was realized. They were telling the truth.
And that's your livelihood.
Absolutely.
Can I ask, when you say like your number was given out, was it another legislator, or you're saying some activist groups somehow got wind of your position? Like, who was the one attacking you? Because obviously there's a lot of moving parts to this. So just clarify for our listeners.
Sure. I don't know who gave it out, but I will tell you there was they worked in concert. The media, even, there was written media that turned against me. I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but I mean, there were reporters that would call me up for interviews, and I would explain very calmly, and just like I'm talking to you, the position. I would talk about the science, and they would still turn around and write a hateful article.
Right.
Like nothing I was saying was resonating. And I was just saying, you all think about this now. In the state of Texas, you cannot even get a tattoo under the age of 18 with parental consent. Why is it you would be able to remove your child's genitals, healthy body parts? I, as a parent, do not have the legal right in Texas, even if my daughter wants it, to tattoo her face.
Right.
So I was saying, let's start there. And then I would give example after example. We raised the age in Texas from 18 to 21, Democrats and Republicans alike, to 21 to smoke, to purchase cigarettes. Yeah. Why? Because the public policy is that that young people cannot appreciate the risk of harm, the long-term risk of cancer.
Yeah.
So we raised it to 21. We raised the age from 18 to 21 to even e-vape.
Yeah. Yeah.
So all of these policies were pushing this one direction, but all of a sudden with this, they wanted no age. So I had reporters calling, activist groups, other colleagues that were turning on me. They stopped speaking to me. One colleague in particular, I'm not going to say her name, a Democrat, she just was her little racist kind of indirect insulted me and walked up to me and said, I'm just so disappointed in you on your stance on SB 14. I remember when your people couldn't even marry my people.
Wow.
She was white.
Whoa.
And I said, excuse me? Who are you referring to? What people? Spit it out. Say what you really mean. So she was basically just trying to shame me into submission as a Black woman, to say, who are you as a Black lady to take this stance? I remember when essentially your people were slaves, or I remember when your people were second-class citizens, and now look at you. So that's when I knew, I go back to once again, that these people had been so indoctrinated that they had just lost all sense of reality. And so I ended up, right before I made this speech, I had been doing my research for a couple of years, you all. So this wasn't off the cuff. And I was writing my words, my statement. And so for people that say I got my statement from a white Republican supremacist or talking points, that's even more of an insult. I've been a lawyer over 25 years. I don't need anyone to write anything for me. Right before, another Democrat came to me, and he really was trying to be kind. But I tell this story so that people understand how infiltrated the party has become. He came to me and he said, Shawn, please don't do it.
Oh my God.
And I said, well, why? And I said, do you honestly agree with all of this? Do you believe this is right for children? And he looked me straight in my eye and he said, absolutely not. I know it's wrong. It's crazy. And I would never allow my children to undergo this. And he said, he was an African American, and he said, and I just believe most Black kids aren't gonna do this. And I said, you don't know that. And I said, but why are you for it then? And he said, because they're going to come against us with everything. He said that they're too powerful. And he said, Shawn, save yourself.
Wow.
And that's when he told me the words, I've said it before. I said, it makes me sick to my stomach to think about a child being harmed. And he said, well, you know what, Shawn? Hold your nose. That's when he said, hold your nose and vote with us. And I said, I cannot. And that's when he said, well, you're going to lose your seat.
Could I
Wow.
ask, just for clarification, that's so powerful. What age was it that you were voting to rise it for, basically medical treatment for gender for children? You were advocating for it to be 18 and over. What age was it? What was it?
Here's what's so sad. We had no
No
age.
age, right? Yeah.
So you could have been 4, 5, 6,
Oh
7,
my
and they
God.
still fought to kill the bill. That's why I was running around frantic, singing the alarm saying, we have to have something, you all. And they didn't propose any age under 18. They wanted no age. So without this legislation, it would have been no guardrails, no safeguards for children.
Yeah.
And yet and still, they still said, hold your nose and vote with us. And so I did know that it was going to be bad. What I did not know is that they would double down so hard on it. I thought that it would be controversial. But I realized after that vote, I became public enemy number one of the party. They started calling different Democratic clubs back where I live in my own district and asking them to censor me. 2 of them censored me, which was just like a public admonishment. And then I realized that I was going to be in the fight of my life.
Wow.
But I do like to say on the positive side, I was censored, but I cannot be silenced.
Yeah.
And I still have the right, as I'm doing today, to speak the truth. And I realize now that was the greater purpose. And that's what they didn't want me to do. I kept asking, I did hear this. I don't believe them, but I did hear, and maybe they're telling the truth, that had I just voted quietly for the bill with the Republicans and not shed the light on the harms, that they possibly would not have come after me so hard, because they ended up putting almost $1 million into my primary and finding a candidate who identified as a dual identity queer Black woman to run against me, who supports all of this medicalization, child mutilation, sex changes for kids. She agrees with it.
Yeah.
So they said it was my speech that did it, which really, to me, again, underscores how serious they are about this.
Yeah. I'd love to touch on that. First of all, I think sunlight is the best disinfectant. So, and also I have to say, I mean, I remember about a year ago seeing your speech. I mean, I was so emotional about it, not only because you were obviously quite nervous and emotional, but you had clearly done your research. A lot of Stella and I have seen this. Lots of politicians come in and out of this subject because I think they realize harms are being done, or they see that this is getting a lot of public attention. But a lot of times people don't really understand the issue, but it was very clear that you understood it. So I think the fact that you laid out the case with such accuracy and clarity is a big threat to people who are trying to make this sound like it's fine. And I want to come back to something you said about your colleague who was an African-American man who said, I just don't think Black kids are going to go for this, because I'm a 20-year Houston Texan myself, not an athlete, but a citizen of the city of Houston. And I worked in a middle school. I've worked with lots of, Black kids, Hispanic kids. And something that I will say is, this is not just a white upper middle class liberal issue. In fact, a lot of young kids from minority backgrounds who happen to be, for example, same-sex attracted, or maybe they are quirky because they have autism, or they're a little bit different, they're particularly vulnerable to trying to find an explanation for why they feel different. And if they're not kids who blend in very well with their peers, they have the same vulnerabilities to this belief system as any other kid from any other background. So I always try to just dispel this myth that this is only happening in a certain type of liberal enclave in a white community. That's not true. And I'm just very concerned
You're
at how
absolutely
quickly
right.
kids are thrown under the bus. It's not going to happen to us. No, it might happen to you. So everyone should be concerned.
And it matters whomever it happens to, but particularly, that's just something that he has no idea about. And I always say, and what's interesting is what we do know, and this was a common statement that's said in the African-American community that doesn't get out too often, but I'll say it. when we talk about healthcare or healthcare disparities. There are a lot of Black leaders that will say when white America has a cold, they say Black America has the flu. And what that really means is eventually it will, because of maybe socioeconomic status or access to certain care, that it gets worse, right? It doesn't mean that white people we're not injecting Black people with the flu. That's not what it means.
Yeah.
But so it was kind of interesting. And I said, well, what makes you think that ultimately when if these people succeed and this becomes mainstream and accepted, which it already is right now, obviously we're fighting it, that this won't be in the African American community at high levels. We see it already. And then I talked to him about the dark history, and this is what they didn't want me to talk about, of the castration of Black males. That took place during slavery. It was a very dark time where Black men were intentionally castrated so that they were no threat to sleeping with white women.
Gee.
And they would use them, and it's called buck breaking.
Wow.
To
like how they talk about horses or cattle.
That's
right?
exactly
Isn't
right.
That?
And so Black men have been castrated, and you know they would felt like they would be safe in certain areas. And the fact that it's shocking to me that a party, these progressives who claim they're for human rights, would be pushing this. And I know for a fact, and I've had this conversation in the Black community, and said, if it were Republicans pushing this, what would you call this?
Yeah.
And you know what they said? Genocide.
Wow.
Jesus.
They would say this was an intentional, slow form of genocide by castrating the Black males first, sterilizing the Black girls so they don't have a menstrual cycle, which means they cannot procreate, which would be a form of depopulation, to eradicate the race ultimately. African Americans, and I'm going to just leave this point here, only make up 12 to 14% of the American population. People think it's much larger. If the majority of African American children, or even 20 to 30%, that like we're seeing in schools, start to believe in this radical ideology and start taking these drugs, or heaven forbid, go get the surgeries, what would happen? So it's just that the message is being muddled, and they're intentionally deceiving people and calling it gender affirming care. And when you put the word care behind something, it sounds like it's all very good.
And affirming sounds great too.
Yeah.
And I want to touch on this one last point about this issue. I remember listening to a very prominent doctor who is an advocate for lowering the age of quote unquote gender affirming care. And she's in Los Angeles. And she was kind of talking about how at her particular hospital, the majority of child patients were white and came from a certain socioeconomic background. And she said, that means that we're really not doing justice to people of color and minorities. And we need to get more racial diversity in here. And it's like, if the most generous interpretation is like, I'm really giving kids life-saving medicine, of course we want to make sure all the Black kids have it and the Hispanic kids. But actually, if you stop and think like, what the heck, you are trying to actually get more and more and more kids to have gender dysphoria and like medicalize them. That's so patently insane.
I mean, we talk about it all the time from so many different examples, and we cannot get them to back down. And so that's why I want people to know. I was at a conference recently, and I was talking with some Republicans, and these were such well-meaning people. And they said, well, how can we talk about this to those that agree in a way that they don't get offended so they can understand? And I said, well, first of all, you have to check your audience and find out if you're even talking to someone who's sincere, because many of these folks well know the truth. And that's where I am on it, you all now. They know the harms. They know what they're doing. And so they're not honest brokers. They don't want to have a real conversation. When now we have the data, we heard it yesterday in the U.S. Supreme case, in the Scrimity case, where I believe it was Justice Alito referenced the Cass report and talked about that children are not less likely to kill themselves because of this. And we have data that talks about all throughout Europe the harms of cross-sex hormones. We actually have data now that talks about puberty blockers actually can cause infertility. The Biden administration even acknowledged that recently. And then yesterday, when they were arguing the case, the lawyer turned right around and said puberty blockers are just a pause and they're reversible. So when you hear people making false statements and false equivalencies, they're not being sincere. And so I think this is just a war against children. And I call upon well-meaning people and people of good conscience and courage. You have to get in the fight if you care about the future of children. I talked with an activist one day who's really big, and she was saying she believes in this and she cares about climate change. And I asked her, and I said, well, she believes in transgenderizing children through hormones and surgeries. I said, who are you leaving the future to? Who are you leaving the planet to? I mean, you want to create an entirely new species of almost people. You want to have children be medical patients for the rest of their lives. You're saying that you don't care if they suffer from osteoporosis, incontinence, the risk of heart attack, early risk of heart attack, stroke, blindness. There's so many other comorbidities that can come from this. Infertility, sterility.
Say no more.
This is the planet. These are the people that you care about. And she just was really quiet and hadn't really thought about it. And that's why I'm saying they're just moving with a swiftness through the use of language and through empathy by trying to get the rest of the country and the world to side with them. But I do believe the tide is shifting. People understand now that the empathy and the sympathy should go to the children who are being abused and manipulated through this.
Yeah.
And the poor parents who don't know what to do, who are being manipulated as well. I mean, I know that there are parents out there that, like the lady that told me her son, like light up shoes, so therefore he was a girl. She was, once I finished talking to her, she was a very lonely woman that was to me seeking to belong.
Yeah.
And she got connected through this movement, through another organization she was in. And she kind of moves from one cause to another. And somehow now this is her new cause. And sadly, her son is an innocent bystander who's now a victim. But for those parents who are being manipulated, that's why the state has to intervene. And we do have a compelling interest to protect children. We've always done it. And I'll leave with this. If a child cannot consent to sex, how can they consent to a sex change? It's the arguments that they're making they're really nonsensical. The arguments that they made before the U.S. Supreme Court was that they're being denied equal protection. And then even Justice Ketanji Brown tried to make it analogous to interracial marriage. That was so disingenuous. That was purely virtue signaling. We know that there was a time when African Americans were not considered a whole person. And so what that argument about in that case, Virginia versus Loving, was to establish that Black people are entitled to equal protection under the law because they are people. They are Americans. They're whole people. And therefore, any rights afforded to white people are afforded to Black people. That has nothing to do with saying a child can consent to a sex change or can consent to taking life-altering drugs. It's no different. We have laws, like I said, children can't consent to sex. They can't purchase alcohol. We're not denying them their equal rights because under the Equal Protection Clause, because they can't go buy vodka.
Yeah, I'd love to ask you as an attorney, maybe you can shed some light on this. And by the way, we recorded this, of course, the day after Scrimetti oral arguments. And I found it really baffling because I don't understand the legal speak. But it sounded like the argument they were trying to make is whether or not it's sex discrimination. So one of the arguments put forward was, if a boy can take testosterone to affirm his manliness and a girl cannot, that's sex discrimination. Now, it was a weird argument because taking a boy taking testosterone to make him more manly is already illegal. It's performance enhancing drugs. It's steroid use. That is already illegal. So it was a very strange argument. But can you explain, like, the angle of sex discrimination was an interesting one, whereas as you're describing, Shawn, this is child protection because of their lack of ability to consent to life-altering decisions. So why did they use the sex discrimination angle?
It's all they had. It was a complete red herring, and it makes no sense. It's complete poppycock, and so I don't even try to defend that or get into some overly intellectualized analysis of that, because it's foolish, it's ridiculous, it has no merit. Boys cannot take, as you said, take testosterone at the age of 10 unless they're sick or there's some kind of underlying illness. Girls cannot even take estrogen at the age of 5 or 6. So it all cancels itself out. It's not sex-based discrimination because it's neutral on its face. The treatment is neutral to both sexes. It's neutral to children. Justice Sotomayor made another weird analogy when the lawyer was talking about the harms. And she said, well, there's risk in everything, even taking aspirin. That was not a serious comment because, and it was a very poorly, it was a poor legal analogy because, one, aspirin are not prescribed. So let me start there.
Yeah.
We're talking about drugs you can't get over the counter, correct?
Right.
So that alone cancels her entire argument. You cannot, we're not asking for these kids have to go ask permission for this treatment. They have to go get drugs that are prescribed by a medical doctor. So you don't have to do that with an aspirin. So already, Justice Sotomayor, you're conceding that the risk of taking an aspirin is relatively low, considering that it's sold over the counter. Number two, what they could have said to her was, Justice, with all due respect, we actually do make baby aspirin. And they're called baby aspirin.
Yeah.
So even then, we draw a distinction with aspirin for children.
Right.
And so that argument should have been turned right back around on her and said, we actually do have baby aspirin because we recognize that children cannot take the same levels of aspirin as adults. So if a child should take baby aspirin, how on earth are we saying a child should be on Lupron, which is a chemical castration drug we give sex offenders?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm doing a PhD on pathways to gender dysphoria among children and adolescents, and the parents have done a survey that their comments are so well thought out, and they've really, really thought about it. The parents, as we all know, but like there's hundreds of parents in this survey, and the amount of them that said variations of, you know what, like the school isn't allowed to give an Advil, you know, without my permission. And yet they can be so high-handed, and socially transition my child. And, you know, some schools have provided binders for children. The schools have really gone way out of their lane, way beyond English and geography and math, into binders and social transition and psychosocial interventions for children that are huge implications. It's extraordinary what has happened. When you put it all together like that, Shawn, it's just so shocking.
It's so sad because I used to believe, I didn't understand why there were people on the conservative side of the aisle that said, no, we don't need mental health treatment in schools. I didn't understand it. You know, I was a proponent of that because I'm thinking real mental health. I'm thinking if you're sad or depressed, you should be able to go to a counselor and talk about what's bothering you. And maybe if there's a sign, they call your parents. Because my mother, as I said, she was an English teacher, but she went on to get her master's in counseling. And she was a guidance counselor, and she was wonderful. Kids would come to her office and tell her things that they were going through at home or what their struggles were. Right. And to this day, we see adults now who are in their 50s and 60s who see my mom in the mall. Oh. And they're like, oh, Miss Thierry, you saved me. You were so sweet. You encouraged me. And she was just But my mother was not going around telling kids to put binders on their chest or that they were born in the wrong body and
Yeah.
what have you. And so I did not know that because of that, now you have people where they don't want any of that discussed at school. They don't want mental health treatment because they feel that people are abusing their counseling. And so now kids, may not have anyone to talk to because we cannot trust that the adults that are there are not actually causing more harm. And that's what's so sad. It's really sad. I didn't believe people in the beginning, but it's real. They clearly have infiltrated schools. When you look at public schools where teachers are walking in, telling kids that they're going to call everyone in the class they and them, that there will be no she's, no he's. There are schools that are doing that. I read that there was a school in California that wanted to change every single report card to they and them. They are excelling in math, or they are doing poorly in English. There will be no girls and boys in the entire school.
Oh,
wow.
dear.
And I mean, I think those are obviously cases that are so strange, but this is a good illustration of your abyss, because when you start pushing these ideas further and further and further, it leads to very strange situations. And I think one thing I've observed just from my own kind of evolution on all these issues is if you are not following this closely, you would have no idea what's happening. So, you hear a lot on, liberals say, oh, those Republicans want to ban books, like, no, we're not talking about banning classic literature or like books written from different cultures. We're talking about books with very disturbing sexual imagery for children. Everybody reasonable would get on board with that unless you're like a pedophile. So it's the way these issues are twisted around to make it sound like these super conservative fuddy-duddies just don't want anyone to learn anything. Like, no, that's not what we're talking about.
I got attacked with that. And I said, well, think about it. This is me, this is Shawn Thierry. If I'm saying, read this book, would you want your child reading this? Why would taxpayer dollars be on this? I mean, books that were fictionalizing. Now, this wasn't sex education, books that were romanticizing incest between a father and a daughter. Horrible passages about it. Books that were teaching kids in a comic strip to how to get naked and take pictures of themselves and upload it on the internet to meet strangers, the book said. And it said to explore, this is a quote, your kinky fantasies. And that pornography can be fun because it's a, quote, sugary treat.
What?
These are real books. And so I'm not even going to bother saying all of the profane part, but that's what they're hoping. They're hoping that we will be so embarrassed to say it because it's so disgusting that no one will know. And so that's what's happening. You're exactly right. I mean, with all of this, I went to churches during my primary, and I was talking to the congregation and different folks and telling them what was going on. And people would come up to me and say, Representative Thierry, baby, we love you. Why is everybody so mad at you? What are they saying about you again? And then when I would tell them what was really going on, and they said, it's okay to give a child a sex change?
Yeah.
I said, well, the bill that I voted for said you can't now until they're 18. And you know what the most common response was? Oh, they're mad at you because you set it too low. They thought that I was supposed to do 21.
Wow.
I said, no, ma'am. No, ma'am. They're mad at me because I did any age. And they were like, what?
Yeah.
Well, I agree with you. That's crazy. But yeah, I still lost my primary because I didn't run on this issue. And I was trying to, the Democrat Party was pushing me, pushing millions of dollars against me. I couldn't raise money. But I had a gentleman tell me, baby, you should have run on it and not run from it.
Yeah.
He said, you have to speak. And I tried, but I sometimes it would fall flat because people were so embarrassed at the conversation.
Yeah.
And so that's what I would like to ask. And that's why I think it's so important what we're doing, with this webinar, with our podcast. How do we get this conversation in the mainstream where people don't think that it's just some fringe thing. And the only thing I can say is I'm so heartened and encouraged that President Trump's administration has taken this on. And then he came flat out early on, right after his win, and looked in the camera and said he will stop sex changes for children and giving them drugs to change their sex. But even then, I wonder if the average American really understands what's going on and what can we do to make them believe us?
Yeah. I think there's a certain type of person who anything Trump requests, suggests, proposes, they're going to go against it just because it came out of Trump's mouth. So that's really sad because I think this should be such a simple, nonpartisan issue. Like I've heard you talking about how both Democrats and Republicans agree children need special protections. That's kind of a very baseline, fundamental idea. So I think it's really sad that there are probably going to be some people that say, well, if it came out of Trump's mouth, it must be bad. And so we have to oppose it. So there's that group. But I think, like you said,
well, we have to start there. I think
we
I
have
love the way
to.
you just said that. That's the premise. That's the argument I would make legally every time.
Yeah.
Because that has been the law of the land, and it's well, as we say under the law, well-established public policy.
Yeah.
I can't go take my 5-year-old to go get married, tomorrow if I want to, even if she wants to. So there are special protections under the law for children, and clearly this falls under that umbrella.
And like your experience at church, I think people's intuitive response to this is not a good idea for kids. So we're so grateful you came on. I love your just practical wisdom around this. In addition to, of course, all of the knowledge that you have and all the research you've done on this issue. So
thank you. And I want to say something really quickly.
Sure.
One of the reasons I speak about this in this very folksy, direct way is because I by being on the other side, I understood that they use the intellectualizing of it to their advantage. And there's a need for the academia. I agree, because as I said in my paper, I had the science and the data, but I've decided to leave that to other people because there are not enough regular conversations being had. And so, and they're counting on people like me not to do that. If you pontificate about anything long enough, you'll just confuse your audience. So that's one of the reasons I don't want folks to think that I don't understand the science, but at the end of the day, there's some basic biology, XX, XY. And we've got to get everyday folks to understand this. And so what they're hoping is that they'll go on CNN tomorrow and they'll put some pro-transgender expert who's going to and run off a bunch of stuff that no one understands. And then somebody on our side is going to come back and have to be swatting those balls away to the point that when it's over, the audience is left confused.
Yeah.
And so I've decided I will not allow that. And I'm going to speak plain and speak the truth so that people understand, because I've noticed when I do that, they're kind of left with nothing.
Yeah.
You're so succinct and you're so right. Like what you were saying earlier, you're a natural psychologist in many ways, that like abusers, whether they're sex abusers or emotional abusers, they often use shame and hurt to kind of silence people. So why would you say that? And embarrassment, they use it. And it's like it's being used on a grand scale, that people are too embarrassed and too ashamed to speak about it. And you just keep on saying it straight. Just keep saying it straight. We don't need to be really clever about this. Just say it straight and keep saying it straight, and the truth will out. So you're a model really of how to kind of just keep pushing the truth. I'm so proud that you're the director of public policy in GenSpect. I'm just so proud that we know you, because you really are the way forward, like saying it straight, moving from the Democrats to the Republican, because they were not appropriate. They did not behave in an appropriate manner. And you said, yeah, I'm out of town. I'm moving over. So thank you so much, Shawn.
Yes. Thank you. It's an honor. And I'm just taking the charge. I think that this is all for the greater good. And I said yesterday in a post on X that anytime we're protecting the well-being, health, and development of children, it's always worth the sacrifice.
Oh,
Thank you so much, Shawn.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
thanks.
Thanks for joining us this week on Gender, a Wider Lens.
If you enjoyed the show, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.
And be sure to visit us on Substack by going to widerlenspod.com. There you can join our listener community, access bonus content and resources, plus learn about additional ways to support the show.
Our discussions are for educational purposes and are not intended as a substitute for mental health services.